hear from Jim Messner. And Jim, I need to apologize to you in advance because some of these acronyms in your resume, um, this is a different, unique world for us. It's really, we really appreciate as a county that Qualcomm is having its best minds come here and share the knowledge with us. So Jim is a Senior Director of Product Management and Global V2X Ecosystem Lead for Qualcomm and develops and executes the CV2X deployment strategy across all global regions. Prior to that, at Qualcomm, he led the automotive standards team. Jim serves as a 5GAA board member, an ITS California board member, the SAE V2X Technical Committee Chair, is on the IEEE ITS Society Board of Governors. He's also active in the Transportation Board. Jim serves as an advisory council member to Mobility 21, led by Carnegie Mellon University. He was a pioneer in vehicle highway automation and vehicle safety communication at the California Partners for Advanced Transit and Highways at UC Berkeley. He also served as the past executive director, executive advisor to Booz Allen Hamilton, and as an independent consultant. He holds a BS and MS degrees from UCLA, as well as USC. Go Trojan. Hi, Jim.
Hi, thank you very much. And I will do my best to define acronyms as I go along. And just for the record, and no need to make apologies, my last name is pronounced Meisner, but that's an artifact of Ellis Island. It's not necessarily anything else. So let me preface this a little bit, and I was fascinated by this topic and fascinated by the previous speakers' remarks. I'm going to do some baselining, and first of all, is technology is not a panacea. Technology is an instrument of policy, and while I'm not going to have explicit words on policy, I note that we have legacy policies in land use, and we have potential future policies in demand management that includes pricing. And also ways to encourage multimodalism and basically ways to make mode choices prior to or en route. And what glues this all together, and the thesis of which I will expand on, is that connectivity and certainly is here and now. So while I'll talk a little bit aspirationally about some technologies, I want to note that most of you have very high-end computer and connectivity devices in your pockets, in your purses. And this type of connectivity, when you start to put that into personal mobility, the way you and I travel, and to put this into what's called transportation system management operations, and you marry that to policy, one can start to get this promise of decarbonization or start to go on that road, figuratively and literally, to decarbonization quicker. And so, again, please keep that in mind. So I'm going to use some fancy words, but in the end, if you have this type of heterogeneous connectivity that's as ubiquitous as possible, and that's nearly there, and you start to marry this with some really smart policy, you can start to address mobility needs at the same time as you start to address the decarbonization needs that we all need. So enough of that. That's a little bit off topic, but hopefully it sets perhaps level sets where I'm coming from, and hopefully it brings me to the level that you're on. So if you go to the next slide, please. And so this kind of says some of what I said, but perhaps in pretty pictures rather than flowery words. And you know, you'll hear this term, and I promise that I'll make definitions along the way, although I only have a few minutes. So V2X is vehicle to everything, and I'll define that a little bit later. But V to everything means a whole bunch of things, everything, right? So the connectivity that you and I might have when we're close together for safety is V2X. The connectivity that you have to the network in order to understand basically what that traffic is, or maybe what some of the modal alternatives are so you can switch modes mid-route, is also V2X, and everything in between. And certainly we have, and you all are part of the 5G revolution. And there are lots of ways to describe 5G, but another one very simple way is it's a big pipe. and it's a very efficient pipe. And therefore, there's more information that could be broadcast or unicast in a larger range in a shorter period of time. So you start to get into, this is when I talk about heterogeneity, you start to get into interesting services, and this is a potpourri here that you see on this slide. So there's certainly safety, the short range, and then there's a teleoperation, which starts to get into this, and I'm not saying this is here and now, I'm saying the connectivity is, but you start to get into various interesting ways of having AVs, which is, I saw Sanjeev Nada's comments that are different than connected vehicles. And I'm here primarily to talk about connected vehicles, but you can see how connectivity can kind of facilitate these near-term and longer-term services, which in total sum up to more efficient travel, not more efficient journeys, but more efficient travel in total, so that you can start to have these types of alternatives up to and including delaying or not having your trip. So this whole idea of a connected highway, certainly the 4G and 5G networks, the CV2X, which I'll talk a little bit about, and because this is a slide that I give and say different words to different people, precise positioning means something more to safety than it does to the gist of this talk. Next slide, please. And so this is just an illustration of what I said before, so I won't belabor it. But I just want to add one point, and I know this is conjecture, and I can actually, given if you press me against the wall, can talk about the literature because I'm quite familiar with it, about the relationship between safety and mobility, or actually congestion. And you know, and I don't need to belabor this also, there's a strong relationship between congestion and emissions. Ergo, if you have a safer vehicle or safer transportation system, you have fewer recurring incidents. Some people conjecture, and again, there's a literature that shows that about 50% of congestion is caused by non-recurring incidents. So if you eliminate crashes, and we want to, or mitigate or ameliorate the crash volume and the crash problem, you start to get into more efficient roadways, which leads to safer. Remember I talked about heterogeneity. This is at the point of play right here. When you take it back into network communications, you know, do you even have to go on that trip that was dangerous? Can you use another mode? Can that mode perhaps be transit? Those are all sorts of things that we can talk about. But suffice it to say, if you have these types of links, vehicle to vehicle, again, I started the slide by talking about safety, vehicle infrastructure, vehicle pedestrian, these are all interesting direct communication modes, which is the CV2X I normally talk about to quite technical audiences and to car companies. But when I talk more broadly, and we live this, we have the V to N. And this is, the sum total is, it's a pretty neat system that addresses safety. I showed you or talked about the link between safety and congestion, and it enhances tremendously personal mobility. And if you're running a regional traffic management operation, it would also allow you to have that type of information that you need to start to enact the types of policies, not just on-ramp meters, but certainly you can even do pricing policies, all sorts of interesting policies that are really outside the scope of me to talk about in PowerPoint, but in the scope of the conversation we all must have. Next slide, please. And so this is that short-range communication, and I don't need to talk about this because there's some complicated terms about spectrum, gigahertz. But suffice it to say, at the kind of frequencies we have at Wi-Fi, you can start to do this short-range communication. What's really important when I talk about this is that this seems pie in the sky, but it really isn't. It's pretty much something that we at Qualcomm have in our products. OEMs want it, depending on what part of the world you're in, and we're on the cusp of having this in the US. So again, I make that safety. Safety is important. It addresses all sorts of interesting aspects, and I made that link, although perhaps not, you know, in the proof point, that it does relate to congestion, which does relate to decarbonization. So again, let's go to the next slide. This slide isn't as important as the overall concept. So what happens when you have this type of connectivity? And I've given you some round numbers, but you know, citations are fairly easy. For example, if you look at the environment, which is the topic of the day, actually it should be the topic of the century for all of us, the up to 20% reduction in CO2 emissions actually comes from a host of studies, one of which is at CE CERT at UC Riverside by Professor Matt Barth. Another comes from Hesham Rocco, who we engage in at Virginia Tech, a group, an acronym that we talked about in the introduction, the 5G Automotive Association, or 5GA, has contacted a Dutch research organization. And we've shown in a literature search that this is a pretty good number. When you have this type of connectivity, you have the efficiencies that I touched on, and you can, with more efficient traffic operations and technology that's really here and now, you can start to affect this type of environmental benefit, which starts to get into the reason that we're meeting here. And I related that to efficiency. I haven't really focused on equity, but equity is pretty important since the underserved suffer disproportionately with safety for sure, but certainly with environmental effects. So if you start to address all of these with the type of different types of links for communication, CV2X does benefit society and the environment. By the way, we at Qualcomm have written a white paper that talks about the benefits of CV2X or V2X, this connectivity that transcends safety, that addresses environment and other types of issues to include equity. So, hopefully the thesis and this initial conclusion is fairly clear. Go to the next slide, please. So this is, again, a general slide, but you can kind of see, certainly this is not the San Diego region, my apologies, but you can see the types of movement made to at least instantiate one aspect of this, which is that it's ready for deployment. The aspect that's not on this slide, which really should be the final word that I have here, is that we all have, again, in our pockets, a mobile phone or purses. Many of us have in our cars this type of telematics connectivity or network access. That is, you have a modem, you have a way to be connected. And when you sum all this up and put this in a sensitive way, policy-oriented way, you can start to have the types of efficiencies that we need in transportation, up to and again, including not doing a personal automobile travel. And you can start to yield this type of these types of benefits. And again, it all comes with the fact that you need this type of information flow, which connectivity affords. That's my last slide, and certainly happy to answer questions.
Thank you, Jim. I will ask you a question that builds up primarily on this technology in terms of, you said it's ready for deployment, and with the information that you have, the technology that you're working with, are there specific ideas for or suggestions for action for many of there are several agencies here in this room and will be watching this presentation for us to do as public agencies. And
certainly I can do this and address some of the very good comments I see in the chat in one fell swoop. Note that I talked about everyone in this panel or in this audience having a cell phone in the pocket. I understand and very sensitive to the fact that not all of us do, but enough of us do that one can enact these types of transportation system management operations. It could still enact some policies based on sourcing those that do. And so while not everyone can yield personal benefits, there is marginal benefit to everyone given this type of connectivity. So I would encourage policymakers and the audiences to think about the tools that you have. This is not certainly there are many vendors out there. But the fact is that if one has information at your fingertips, then one can enact the policies that you want. So again, use the types of connectivity that exist today and the travelers that may have them to benefit the larger population.
Thank you, Jim. And from an individual level and consumer perspective, are there gaps in our knowledge about or potential technological advances that that we don't know about yet that we should be planning for?
Well, I did talk about this V2X, which may be a new term for many of you. Comes off my tongue rather easily. But think about it more broadly than sometimes even I use it. Think about the fact that one needs to have basically this ubiquitous communication. We can leverage that. So the gap in our knowledge is really the understanding of how to leverage what we have right now. One little gap in their knowledge that is pretty important and actually essential for public sector policymakers to really understand is the idea of trackability and privacy. And again, this is a long discussion, but one can separate that from the individual. So what we're trying to do is provide this type of aggregated crowd information to allow better transportation operations, ultimately to enact the types of policies that we're considering.
Thank you, Jim. And one final question, which I ask every panelist, is what can the county do in bringing together different stakeholders and players to the table for regional action on decarbonizing the transportation sector?
You know, that is a difficult and very good question, and one that I humbly say that I can't answer that well, but let me make an attempt. Is that remember, and you've read my resume, that almost everything I see is the litmus of transportation and technology. So I noticed that when you talk about the food system, or when you talk about land use, the tying theme is everything needs to be moved, right? Goods movement. So in the end, you know, the fact that things need to be moved brings everything into the common denominators, that if you start to address these efficiencies or inefficiencies in our transportation system, it benefits other segments.
Thank you very much for your time, Jim. Really
You're
appreciate you
welcome.
coming here and joining us.
Well, it's my honor and privilege.
Thank you.
Pleasure, actually.
And
thank you.
our final stakeholder presentation today is from Kyle Hiskala. Kyle is a climate justice